Why did the compound feel so silent that morning, like the world itself was holding its breath? Sarah Martinez stood in the middle of her quarters, staring at the duffel bag she had been packing for hours but couldn't quite bring herself to close. The early sun crept in through the window, bouncing off the whitewashed walls of the military hospital compound, painting everything in gold. 18 months. That was how long she had lived inside these walls, surrounded by antiseptic and dust, by blood and laughter, by screams and silences that echoed long after the generators had gone quiet. Today was supposed to be different. Today was her discharge day. Her hands trembled as she folded the last uniform, smoothing the fabric like it mattered, like she wasn't just leaving behind clothing but an entire identity stitched into every crease. Combat medic, 82nd Airborne Division, 24 years old. A lifetime compressed into a year and a half, where she had seen more blood than birthdays, more endings than beginnings. Her fingers brushed the edge of her medical patch, and she felt something inside her chest tighten. She should have been smiling. Instead, her reflection in the dusty mirror showed a young woman who looked far older than she had any right to. Major Thompson had praised her yesterday, told her she had saved more lives than doctors twice her age. She had nodded silently, swallowing the lump in her throat, afraid that if she spoke, her voice might betray how unsure she was. Was she ready to leave? Or was leaving just another kind of wound she wasn't trained to treat? The other medics had thrown her a farewell the night before. A plastic table, cans of soda, and laughter that sounded too forced, too fragile, as though they were all trying to push back the shadow of what tomorrow might bring for them. Private Johnson, barely 19, had asked her what she planned to do back in Texas. She had shrugged, pretending it was an easy question. But inside, she knew she had no idea. Civilian life was a landscape she couldn't quite imagine anymore. How do you go back to choosing breakfast cereal when you've spent months choosing which patient gets morphine when supplies are low? Her hand slipped into the duffel's side pocket and touched the folded letter she had never sent. A letter to her parents. Words that tried and failed to capture the weight of what Afghanistan had done to her. How could she explain the adrenaline of clamping an artery in the middle of gunfire? Or the strange, fierce love she felt for the brothers in arms she had patched up, held together with sutures, gauze, and prayers whispered under her breath? The briefing that morning had been routine. Nothing unusual, they'd said. No incoming wounded. No enemy chatter worth worrying about. Even a hint of a ceasefire in the nearby villages. For once, hope had dared to show its face. Maybe, just maybe, her last day would be quiet. But hope had always been a dangerous thing in war zones. She made her rounds anyway, one last walk through the ward that had been her world. Sergeant Williams, who'd lost his leg to an IED 3 weeks ago, greeted her with the kind of smile that reached his eyes for the first time since his injury. He joked about her trading military rations for Texas barbecue, and she laughed, but the sound of it hurt her chest. These men were not just patients, they were family. Leaving them felt like walking away from people who had trusted her with their pain, their fears, their very breath. The helicopter was scheduled for 1400, a flight to the main base, then Germany, then finally home. The word home felt almost foreign. Her civilian clothes were folded at the bottom of her bag, but when she looked at them, they felt like costumes for a role she no longer knew how to play. So she stalled. She organized supplies that didn't need organizing, checked charts already triple-checked. Anything to delay closing that bag. To delay admitting this was ending. To delay admitting that Sarah Martinez, combat medic, would soon just be Sarah again. When the loudspeakers crackled with the noon announcements, she listened like someone memorizing a song they'd never hear again. Even the routine felt sacred now. At the mess hall, she forced herself to eat rice, beans, and bread. It tasted like every other lunch she'd had here, but today every bite seemed heavier, like it carried the weight of memory. She caught herself watching the faces of the other soldiers, wondering if any of them realized how lucky they were to still be anonymous in her memory. For everyone she saved, she carried a face she hadn't. Later, as the sun climbed higher, she walked Corporal Davis, her replacement, through the medical bay one last time. His notebook filled with her words, but she knew experience couldn't be transferred with ink. He would make his own mistakes, mistakes that would carve themselves into his bones the way hers had. The low thrum of rotors reached her ears, distant at first, then closer, like a reminder that time was no longer hers to control. The helicopter was coming. But so was something else. Major Thompson appeared in the doorway, his expression shadowed. "Martinez, we need to talk." Her stomach knotted. Conversations that started that way rarely carried good news. Outside, the sun burned hot against her skin. Thompson's voice was quiet but edged with steel. Intelligence picked up chatter. Possible sniper activity in the hills overlooking the LZ. Nothing confirmed, but enough to make the pilot nervous. Sarah's eyes followed his gesture toward the rocky ridges. 1,000 yards away, scrub brush and stone, plenty of places for death to hide. She had patched up soldiers hit by unseen rifles, had felt their blood on her hands as they whispered last words. The hills looked empty, but she knew better. Emptiness was often the most dangerous disguise. "What are my options?" she asked. Her voice didn't shake, but inside everything did. "Delay your departure. Tomorrow may be longer, or take the risk. The pilot thinks he can get in and out fast, minimal time on the ground." Her parents were expecting her call from Germany tonight. Her sister had taken time off to meet her at the airport. Her whole future was waiting just past those hills. And yet, between her and it was a decision that felt heavier than any rucksack she had carried. Stay and prolong the ache of belonging and not belonging. Go and risk becoming another folded flag. She thought of Sergeant Williams, of how she had worked 6 hours straight to keep him alive for a promise he'd made, to see his daughter's first steps. She remembered his wife's video of that little girl stumbling across the living room floor. That was why she had become a medic, not for adrenaline, not for medals, for the thread of life that connected people, fragile but worth everything. "I want to go," she said finally. "I need to go." Thompson studied her for a long moment, then nodded. 2 hours. If you change your mind, the option's still open. As he left, Sarah kept her eyes on the hills. Somewhere out there, someone might be watching, waiting, but the pull of home was stronger than the fear. She finished her round slowly, saying goodbye in ways that didn't sound like goodbyes. She reminded Davis again about details he'd learned the hard way soon enough. When he asked her how she knew when to push a patient to fight or when to let them rest, she told him the truth. "You don't. Not at first. You make mistakes and you live with them." By the time the rotors thundered overhead, dust kicking up like a storm, Sarah felt her chest tighten. Soldiers gathered near the gate to see her off. Faces that had become her family, all wearing the same quiet expression, pride mixed with the knowledge that pride and grief often walked hand in hand. She shouldered her duffel and stepped forward, toward the helicopter, toward whatever waited in those hills. And as she walked, one thought pulsed louder than the noise of the rotors, louder than the shouts of her comrades, louder than the fear that clawed at her chest. This was supposed to be the end, but something was telling her it was only the beginning. What if this ride home was the one she didn't survive? The thought came sharp and uninvited as Sarah jogged toward the waiting helicopter. Dust stung her eyes, kicked up in choking clouds by the pounding rotors. Every step felt heavier than the last, like her boots were sinking into the Afghan earth itself, refusing to let her go. Behind her, voices shouted goodbyes, words snatched away by the engine's roar. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The crew chief's hand grabbed her arm, hauling her into the cabin with practiced strength. Inside, the air smelled of oil and metal, the familiar scent of countless medevacs. But this time, she wasn't treating the wounded. This time, she was the one leaving. Canvas seats lined the walls. 2 soldiers she didn't recognize were already strapped in, their faces blank but their eyes restless. She nodded to them, forcing her breathing steady, even as her pulse thudded in her ears. Martinez, the crew chief, barked over the engines. She nodded. Buckle in, fast climb, minimal exposure. Sarah tightened the straps across her chest, fingers fumbling only once before locking the buckle. Through the scratched window beside her, she caught a last glimpse of Major Thompson, his cap in his hand, watching with a face that gave nothing away. A part of her wanted to believe he was silently wishing her safe passage. Another part wondered if he was preparing himself never to see her again. The helicopter lurched upward. The compound shrank below, turning into a scatter of white buildings, the courtyard now no bigger than a coin. Dust spiraled upward, swallowed by the endless desert sky. For a heartbeat, Sarah let herself breathe. Then she heard it. A sound that didn't belong. A sharp metallic ping. Not loud, not dramatic, just wrong. The kind of sound only someone who had listened to helicopters for months could recognize as foreign. Her head snapped toward the cockpit. The pilot's shoulders had stiffened. A red light glowed faintly on the panel. Small arms fire. The words cut through the headset, clipped and controlled, but Sarah's stomach dropped as if the floor had disappeared beneath her. She pressed her face to the glass, scanning the hills. Nothing but rocks and brush, yet she knew better. The enemy was there. Invisible, patient, measuring angles and distances that could mean life or death. Another strike. A metallic thud reverberated through the cabin. This time the lights flared brighter on the console. The pilot cursed under his breath. We're losing hydraulics. Sarah's training surged forward, automatic, as if her body had been waiting for the moment chaos returned. She unclipped, grabbed the nearest kit, and slid across the cabin to the crew chief, who was already opening the emergency pack. "How bad?" she shouted. "Not critical yet, but we'll have to set down." His voice was grim, steady, like he'd said those words too many times in his career. Sarah's throat tightened. She had treated the aftermath of downed birds, men pulled from wreckage with burns, broken spines, or nothing left to save. And now she was inside one. The pilot's voice returned over the intercom. "We've got a clearing 3 miles ahead. Flat ground looks workable. We'll try for it." Sarah looked outside again. The landscape slid beneath them, brown fields, dirt roads snaking like veins, scattered mud brick houses half abandoned. Her mind wasn't just searching for cover. It was searching for escape routes, triage possibilities, survival chances. That instinct never left. She caught the crew chief's eye. He gave a short nod, a soldier's language for be ready for anything. The descent came fast, too fast. The helicopter groaned against the strain, its frame trembling as the pilot fought for control. Sarah's body slammed against her harness, her breath knocked from her lungs as the ground surged up to meet them. Impact. A shudder through every bolt and rivet. The nose dipped, the cabin jerked sideways, then they were down, rough, uneven, but alive. Dust blasted in through the open side door, coating her tongue with grit. For a moment, silence. Then the ticking of cooling metal, the creak of strained hydraulics, the sound of her own breath, too loud in her ears. "Status," the pilot called. "Birds crippled," the crew chief replied. "Won't fly till we patch the hydraulics, and even then," he didn't finish the sentence. Sarah unbuckled, forcing her shaking hands to stay steady. She stepped out into the clearing, the Afghan sun hitting her like a wall. The world smelled of dust, fuel, and something else, danger, invisible but close. The crew chief crouched near the fuselage, tracing bullet holes with his gloved hand. "Professional work," he muttered. "Somebody knew exactly where to hit." The words chilled Sarah more than the bullets had. Not random, not luck. A sniper who knew what he was doing. Someone who hadn't wanted to kill them outright, just ground them. Which begged the question, why? A sound cut across the silence. Low, distant at first, then growing louder. An engine. Sarah's body went rigid. The co-pilot raised binoculars, his voice tight. "Pickup truck, south approach, 2, maybe 3 inside. The crew chief moved fast, distributing weapons. A rifle in one soldier's hands, a pistol shoved into Sarah's. She checked the safety magazine chamber, movements drilled long ago, buried under layers of medical instinct but never forgotten. The truck rolled closer. Old Toyota, faded blue, rust eating the edges. It stopped 100 yards away. The engine cut. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then the driver's door opened. A man stepped out. Not armed, not rushing. Just walking. Traditional Afghan clothing, hands lifted in the universal language of "I'm not here to shoot." His steps were measured, deliberate, the way someone walked who knew exactly how close to push tension without snapping it. "That's far enough," the pilot shouted. The man halted, his voice carried across the dust, accented but clear. "I am not here to harm you. My name is Ahmed Hassan. I am a doctor, and I know who shot at your helicopter." Sarah's chest tightened. The word doctor pulled at her instincts, but every warning bell inside her screamed caution. Civilians didn't just walk into crash sites. Not alive. Not unless they had a reason. Ahmed reached into his pocket, slow, deliberate, pulled out a small radio, tossed it gently into the dirt halfway between them. "The shooter has been using this frequency," he said. "His name is Malik. He was not aiming to kill. He was aiming to bring you down, to bring her down." "Sorry." Sarah froze. The man's eyes had locked on her. Recognition. Not personal, not like he had met her before, but something heavier, like he knew her story. The crew chief's rifle never wavered. Why her? Ahmed's answer came quiet, but it struck Sarah like a blow. "Because he wants to speak to the American medic, the woman doctor who has been here 18 months. He will not let you leave until he has spoken with her." For a moment the world spun. Sarah's pulse thundered. This wasn't random. This entire ambush, this entire day, it had never been about the helicopter. It had been about her. Why would an enemy sniper want to meet a medic? The question pulsed through Sarah's mind as she stood in the clearing, dust swirling around her boots, her pulse loud in her ears. Ahmed Hassan's words still echoed, heavy and impossible to ignore. The man in the hills, the one who had disabled their helicopter with surgical precision, hadn't fired to kill. He had fired to force them down. And he had done it for her. The crew chief's weapon never lowered, his jaw clenched tight. The pilot muttered into the radio, trying to keep headquarters updated, though static cut through every transmission. The two soldiers shifted restlessly, their rifles aimed toward the silent hills. Sarah's own pistol felt alien in her hand, heavy, wrong. She was a healer, not a fighter. But here she was, standing in the dust, a target for reasons she couldn't begin to understand. "Why me?" she finally asked. Her voice cracked, but not from fear, at least not only fear. There was something else inside her, a flicker of anger. If she had been marked, if someone had gone to this much trouble to stop her from leaving, she needed to know why. Ahmed's gaze softened. 6 months ago, you treated a boy shot in the chest, my nephew. His name was Fared." Sarah's breath caught. Her mind raced back through hundreds of cases, faces, wounds, nights blurred into endless hours under harsh fluorescent light. And then she saw him, a teenager, barely 17, brought in unconscious, a hole torn through his chest. Half the team had wanted to let him go to save resources for soldiers they could be sure of. But Sarah had refused. 8 hours she'd fought for that boy, her hands slick with his blood, her voice hoarse from barking orders. She hadn't known his name. Hadn't known if he was friend, enemy, or just unlucky. She had only known that he was alive. "I remember," she whispered. "I saved him." Ahmed nodded. "You did, and that boy was Malik's younger brother." The clearing seemed to tilt under her feet. A sniper in the hills. A brother searching for the woman who had saved family he thought lost. None of it made sense. Gratitude didn't usually come with bullets. "If I saved his brother," she said, her throat dry, "then why shoot us down?" Ahmed's answer came like a shadow across the sun. Because Malik is hunted by both sides, he could not approach your base. You were leaving today. He had one chance left to speak to you. He took it." Sarah stared toward the ridgeline, her chest rising and falling too fast. If that was true, then this man, this sniper, had orchestrated the entire ordeal just to speak with her. A gesture born not of hostility but desperation. But she had lived long enough in Afghanistan to know desperation could be as dangerous as hate. The radio on the ground crackled, a voice in Pashto, sharp and low. Ahmed listened, then turned back to them. "He is coming down, alone. He promises safe passage once he has spoken with her." Safe passage. The words should have eased her. They didn't. 20 minutes later, a solitary figure appeared, moving down from the jagged ridge. He walked slow, deliberate, his hands empty, visible. The desert sun painted him in hard light, his shadow long behind him. His clothes were simple, brown tunic, worn sandals, a cap pulled low. But the way he carried himself, straight-backed, unbroken, told Sarah this was a man who had lived through too much. Malik. Every soldier's rifle followed his steps. Dust rose with each one. The silence was unbearable. He stopped 20 feet away. His dark eyes locked on Sarah, not hostile, not pleading, something in between, a weight she couldn't name. He spoke in Pashto, voice low but steady. Ahmed translated. "He says he is honored to meet the woman who saved his brother's life. He apologizes for the way he brought you here, but he says it was the only way to make sure you would listen." Sarah swallowed hard, her throat tight. The pistol felt heavier, so she lowered it, sliding it back into its holster. "Tell him I remember his brother," she said. Her voice shook but steadied as she added, "Tell him I'm glad the boy lived." Ahmed translated. Malik's face shifted. A smile, not wide, not triumphant, but something softer, relief. He reached into a small bag slung across his shoulder. The soldiers tensed, rifles cocking. Malik froze, then moved slowly, carefully, drawing something wrapped in white cloth. He held it out toward Sarah. Ahmed's voice carried the words across the distance. "This belonged to his father. He was a doctor in Kabul before the wars. Malik wants you to have it as respect, from one healer to another." Sarah stepped forward, her boots crunching on gravel, every instinct screaming at her to stay back. But something stronger pulled her on. She accepted the bundle. Fingers unwrapped the cloth. A stethoscope, old, worn smooth by years of use but cared for. The metal tarnished, the tubing cracked in places, but it was whole. Her throat closed. She blinked hard, but tears still came. This wasn't a weapon. It was a gift, a bridge. She looked up at Malik. "Thank you," she whispered. But Malik wasn't finished. He spoke again, faster now, urgency in his tone. Ahmed translated, each word sinking like a stone. "He has information, important, about planned attacks against medical facilities." The air seemed to thin. Sarah's heart hammered. What kind of attacks? Ahmed's eyes darkened as he translated. "Coordinated strikes. Next week. Foreign fighters. They want to cripple your hospitals, kill your doctors. They believe if they take away your ability to heal, your soldiers will break." The pilot swore under his breath. The crew chief moved closer, listening hard. Malik spoke again, pulling a notebook from his bag, flipping through pages scrawled with maps and names. Ahmed translated in rapid bursts. "He knows the leaders, the caches, the timing, but he will only give it to her." Sarah's mouth went dry. "Me." "Yes," Ahmed said softly, "because he trusts you, not your army, you." The clearing spun again. She thought of every time she had stood over a patient, choosing to fight for them no matter what uniform they wore. She thought of the boy on the table 6 months ago, his chest torn open, his youth spilling out between her hands. She had never asked who he was. She had only asked, could he live? Malik's eyes told her that answer had carried farther than she ever imagined. Her hands shook as she held the stethoscope. She looked around, the crew chief, cautious but steady, the pilot, already reaching for his radio, The soldiers, weapons never leaving the man who had brought them down. It should have been simple: take the notebook, pass it along, let intelligence decide. But nothing here was simple. If she took it, she wasn't just a medic anymore. She wasn't just Doc Martinez. She would be carrying a message from a man hunted by both sides, a man whose truth would be doubted, twisted, used. And yet, if she didn't take it, if she walked away, people would die. Doctors, nurses, patients. People like her, people who trusted healers to be beyond politics, beyond war. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Tell him I'll listen." Ahmed translated. Malik's eyes softened, and for the first time since he appeared, his shoulders lowered, as though some invisible burden had shifted. He began to speak, his words spilling like water finally breaking a dam. Ahmed followed, translating faster than Sarah could process. Names, dates, locations. A plot that stretched wider than she dared imagine, every detail falling into her hands because once she had refused to let a boy die. And in that dust-choked clearing, Sarah Martinez realized the truth. This wasn't about leaving anymore. This was about carrying something forward, something larger than herself. What do you do when the truth is handed to you by someone everyone else calls the enemy? Sarah stood in the dusty clearing, the sun beginning to fall lower, its light turning orange against the ridges. Malik's words came fast, urgent, carried into English through Ahmed's steady voice. He spoke of caches hidden in barns, of fighters moving under cover of night, of plans to strike not soldiers, not tanks, but hospitals. Places where the wounded clung to life. Places where healers bent themselves against death's shadow. Her notebook filled quickly, her handwriting rushed and uneven. But this wasn't just ink on paper. This was blood and futures. She could hear it in Malik's tone, each name, each place, each date, spoken like he was pulling secrets straight from his bones. The crew chief leaned in close, his weapon still raised but his eyes tracking the words. The pilot, headset crackling with static, muttered updates into the radio, his face pale under streaks of dust. The two soldiers kept their rifles trained on Malik, but Sarah could see their confusion. None of this matched the picture they had been taught. Finally, Malik stopped. His hand trembled as he pulled the last scrap of paper from his pocket, a crude map drawn with black ink, smudged from sweat. Ahmed passed it to her. "He says this is all he has. He trusts you to make sure it is used to save lives, not to justify killing more." Sarah held the notebook and the map like they weighed 100 pounds. Around her, the clearing felt too small, too exposed, as if the weight of the decision might break the earth itself. Why her? Because she hadn't asked questions that night 6 months ago. She hadn't asked if the boy was Taliban or villager. She had only seen a teenager fighting for breath. She had only seen a human life. And that single choice had rippled outward until it reached this exact moment. Malik spoke again, his tone shifting, heavier. Ahmed's voice carried it across the silence. "He warns you. Some of your commanders will not believe. Some will twist this, make it fuel for retaliation. You must be careful." Sarah's chest tightened. He was right. Intelligence didn't exist in a vacuum. It passed through filters, through layers of suspicion, through politics and ambition. A notebook from a hunted Afghan fighter, who would trust it, who would see what he meant it to be. Her hands trembled as she closed the notebook. "Tell him," she said, her voice catching, "that I'll make sure it reaches the right people, people who still remember what healing means." Ahmed translated. Malik's expression softened, and for the first time Sarah saw something unexpected: gratitude. A sound broke the moment, the low thrum of rotors, distant but growing. Rescue. The co-pilot lifted his binoculars, scanning the horizon. 2 birds inbound, 15 mics out. Dust stirred again in the clearing. The soldiers shifted, relief mixing with tension. They weren't alone anymore. Backup was coming, but Sarah felt no relief. Instead, dread coiled inside her. Because once those helicopters landed, the story would no longer be hers to tell. Malik would vanish back into the hills, hunted again. The notebook would pass to officers who saw numbers before they saw people, and the fragile bridge built here, between healer and sniper, between enemies who had chosen to see humanity, might collapse under the weight of bureaucracy. Malik seemed to sense it too. His words grew urgent, flowing faster through Ahmed's voice. He says he must leave before your soldiers arrive. He will not survive if they find him here, but he wants you to know his brother Faird is alive because of you. Faird studies medicine now. He wants to be like you. Sarah's throat closed. She stared at Malik, the man who had brought her helicopter down, the man who could have killed her with a single bullet but had chosen not to. The man whose brother now dreamed of becoming a healer because she hadn't walked away. The world tilted. The dust, the heat, the smell of fuel, it all faded. In that moment, all she could see was the truth. Her hands had stitched more than a wound that night. They had stitched a possibility. Malik stepped closer, slow, deliberate. The rifles followed his every move, but Sarah raised her hands slightly, wordless, telling them to hold. He reached into his pocket again, pulled free something small, worn smooth from use. A bracelet, braided leather with beads of metal. He pressed it into her palm through Ahmed's translation. Faird made this during his recovery. He wanted you to have it, to remember that healing creates bonds that last beyond the wounds themselves. Sarah closed her fist around it, the rough leather warm from Malik's hand. She couldn't speak. She could only nod, tears stinging her dust-crusted eyes. The sound of helicopters grew louder now, their rotors cutting the sky into pieces. Searchlights swept the ridges, beams slicing through the gathering dusk. Soldiers would be here within minutes. Malik glanced once toward the approaching aircraft, then back at her. His eyes lingered, heavy with meaning, with trust, with a plea she couldn't put into words. Then he turned, moving back toward the waiting truck, Ahmed following. Sarah wanted to stop him, wanted to say something, anything that would promise his risk wasn't in vain, but the words died in her throat. Because promises in war were fragile things, and she couldn't offer him what he needed most, safety. The pickup's engine coughed to life, rattled, and began to crawl away across the clearing. Dust rose in its wake, swallowing the figures until they became shadows, then nothing at all. Moments later, the first rescue helicopter roared overhead, its lights glaring white against the darkening hills. Soldiers spilled out, weapons raised, voices barking commands. The clearing was suddenly alive with movement, dust, adrenaline. A major strode toward her, his uniform crisp despite the chaos. His voice was clipped, urgent. "Martinez, what happened here? Who were those civilians?" Sarah's heart thudded. This was the moment Malik had warned her about. Every word she chose now would decide whether his sacrifice meant anything at all. She straightened, the bracelet hidden in her clenched fist, the notebook heavy against her chest. Her voice came steady, stronger than she felt. "Sir, we've received actionable intelligence about planned attacks on medical facilities. The source is credible. This information must reach intelligence immediately. Lives depend on it." The major's eyes narrowed. Where did it come from? Sarah chose her words carefully, balancing on the knife's edge between truth and survival. From someone who opposes attacks on doctors and patients, someone with access to insurgent planning. He gave it willingly so it could prevent bloodshed. The major's eyes flicked to the horizon where the dust trail from Malik's truck was fading into darkness. Suspicion lingered there, sharp and hard. But the weight of the notebook in his hands, names, places, dates, drawn with desperate care, pulled him silent. Around them, the soldiers secured the clearing, checked the damaged bird, scanned the hills. The noise of engines, radios, shouted commands filled the air, but Sarah heard none of it. She only heard the echo of Malik's final words through Ahmed. "Healing is more important than fighting." Why did the notebook feel heavier than her entire rucksack? Sarah sat in the corner of the transport helicopter, its engines vibrating through her bones, the night sky visible through the scratched window. The rescue team had secured the clearing, lifted her and the others out, and left the crippled bird behind under guard. Now they were flying toward the main base, toward safety, or something that looked like it. The notebook sat on her lap, closed, but she could feel the weight of every page. Each name, each date, each sketch of a map seemed alive, pressing against her like it wanted to escape. The major who had taken it from her earlier now held it across the cabin, flipping through the pages by the light of a red lamp. His jaw tightened as he read, his lips moving as if testing the words. "Where exactly did this come from, Martinez?" he finally asked. Sarah's fingers tightened around the bracelet hidden under her sleeve. "From someone who didn't want to see doctors and patients die. That's all you need to know." The major's eyes narrowed. "That's not an answer." "It's the truth," she said quietly. Her voice was steady, but inside her stomach turned. She could see the suspicion in his face, the calculation. To him, intelligence was currency. It wasn't about saving lives, it was about leverage, about strategy, about what could be gained. She wanted to believe he would see it differently, but doubt gnawed at her. The helicopter shuddered slightly in turbulence and she closed her eyes. For a moment she let the noise drown her out. She thought of Malik's eyes, the way they had softened when Ahmed translated her promise. She thought of the old stethoscope resting in her duffel, wrapped carefully in the same white cloth. She thought of Ferd, somewhere in Kabul, bent over a book, dreaming of saving lives instead of taking them. The ripples of her choices stretched farther than she had ever imagined, but ripples could be swallowed by oceans. When they landed at the base, floodlights painted the tarmac harsh white. Soldiers moved with purpose, loading gear, shouting instructions, but Sarah felt removed from it all, like she was watching a film without sound. The major strode ahead, the notebook under his arm. She followed, clutching her duffel, every step heavier than the last. Inside the operations tent, the air was stale with coffee and sweat, radios chattering in the background. Maps covered the walls. Officers bent over tables, their voices low and urgent. The major set the notebook down in front of a colonel, who raised an eyebrow but said nothing as he opened it. Silence fell as he read. Page after page, his expression shifted from skepticism to something harder to read, concern, maybe, or calculation. Finally, he looked up at Sarah, and the source. Sarah swallowed, anonymous but credible. "That's vague." "It's the only way it works," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "If I give you his name, you'll never trust the information, and he'll be dead within a week. What matters isn't who gave it, it's what it says, and it's saying you need to move. Now." The colonel studied her, his eyes cold and assessing. "You're a medic, Martinez. You're not intelligence. Why would someone hand this to you?" Because she hadn't asked the wrong question 6 months ago. Because she had seen a boy instead of a threat. Because healing had crossed a line that fighting never could. But she couldn't say any of that. Not here, not to him. "He trusted me," she said simply, "and I'm trusting you to act on it." The silence stretched. Radios buzzed faintly in the background. Somewhere outside, a helicopter lifted off, the thrum fading into the distance. Finally, the colonel closed the notebook. "We'll verify. If this is real, we'll act. If it is—" He didn't finish the sentence. Sarah felt heat crawl up her neck. "If it isn't, you'll lose nothing but time. If it is and you ignore it, you'll lose lives, doctors, patients, soldiers, people who trusted us to keep them safe." Her words hung in the air, heavier than the notebook itself. The colonel didn't respond. He handed the notebook to an aide and turned away, already onto the next crisis. Sarah stood frozen, anger burning in her chest. Outside, the desert night was cool, the sky littered with stars. She sat alone on a concrete step, staring at the bracelet on her wrist, feeling its roughness against her skin. The memory of Malik's voice lingered in her mind. He hadn't trusted the system. He had trusted her. And she had just handed his truth into hands that might twist it into something he had feared. For the first time since that morning, Sarah's confidence cracked. Had she done the right thing? Or had she just betrayed the very trust that had been placed in her? The questions pressed down harder than any battlefield injury she had ever treated. There was no bandage for doubt, no suture for betrayal. A shadow moved nearby. Corporal Davis, her replacement, approached hesitantly. "You okay, Doc?" She managed a thin smile. "That's not my name anymore, remember." He shrugged. "Doesn't matter, you'll always be Doc to us." His words stung, because being Doc had meant something here. It had meant saving lives, standing between chaos and hope. But what did it mean now, when the life she was trying to save wasn't on an operating table, but on a sheet of paper in a notebook she no longer controlled? She looked at Davis, saw the nervousness in his young eyes, the way he tried to mask it with casual words. He didn't know yet how heavy trust could feel. He would. One day he would. "Take care of them," she said softly. "All of them, not just the wounds you can see." He nodded, unsure but willing to try. Sarah leaned back against the wall, closing her eyes. The bracelet pressed into her wrist, a reminder of promises made in dust and dusk. Somewhere in the hills, Malik was disappearing into shadows again. Somewhere in Kabul, his brother was studying medicine, inspired by a decision she had made without thinking 6 months ago. And somewhere inside this base, men in uniforms were deciding whether those ripples would grow into waves or vanish without a trace. For the first time in months, Sarah felt powerless, not against bullets or blood loss, but against indifference, against systems too large to bend for the truth of a single man's trust. She whispered into the night, a prayer, a promise, a plea. "Don't let them waste this." How long could silence last before it felt like betrayal? 3 days had passed since Sarah had handed over Malik's notebook. 3 long days where the desert sun rose and fell over the base, and still no word. She kept expecting an officer to call her in, to tell her the intelligence had been acted on or dismissed. Instead, there was nothing. Just routine briefings she wasn't part of anymore, sideways glances from soldiers who knew she was leaving, and a growing hollow ache inside her chest. Her duffel sat by her bunk, packed and repacked until the fabric seemed weary of her hands. She was supposed to be gone by now. Discharge papers signed, flight to Germany taken, civilian clothes waiting at the bottom of her bag. But each time her departure approached, some excuse delayed it. Paperwork, logistics, whether she knew better. It wasn't logistics, it was the notebook. Command wasn't finished with her, not yet. The bracelet on her wrist became her anchor. Each time doubt crept in, had she made the right choice, had she betrayed Malik's trust? She turned the leather between her fingers, remembering his eyes, the way he had pressed it into her hand. He hadn't asked for promises. He had given her something to carry, as if he knew her silence might matter as much as her words. On the fourth morning, the silence broke. A colonel she hadn't met before appeared at her quarters, his voice clipped. "Martinez, come with me." Her stomach dropped. She followed him across the compound to a secure briefing room, where a small group of officers sat around a table. The notebook lay open in the center, its pages covered with notes, red marks, circles. The colonel tapped the map with his finger. This information was accurate. His voice was flat, professional, but the weight behind the words was unmistakable. "We intercepted communications confirming coordinated plans to hit 4 medical facilities. Timelines matched. Locations matched. We were able to move personnel and patients out in time." Sarah's breath caught. Relief surged through her, so fierce it felt like her knees might give. Malik had been telling the truth. Lives had been saved. But the colonel wasn't finished. 17 medical staff, over 100 patients, evacuated before the strikes. Without this, he gestured to the notebook, we would have lost them. The words should have been enough to lift her. Instead, they pressed her down. Because for every life saved, there was another question. What would the military do with this? Would Malik's warning be remembered for what it was, a plea to protect healers? Or would it become just another justification in an endless cycle of operations, raids, and retaliation? Another officer leaned forward. "Where did you get this?" Sarah's jaw tightened. "From someone who trusted me, that's all I can say." "That's not good enough." "It has to be." The silence that followed was sharp, cutting. Finally, the colonel closed the notebook. "You're being discharged, effective immediately. Whatever you brought us, it's now in our hands. You're done here, Martinez." Dismissed just like that. She walked out of the briefing room, the sun blinding after the dim interior. Around her, soldiers moved with purpose, the rhythm of the bass unchanged. For them, it was another day. For her, it was the end. But endings never felt this heavy. That night, lying awake on her bunk, she turned the bracelet over and over in her fingers. Malik's warning had been right. His trust had not been misplaced. But what haunted her was the look in his eyes when he handed her the notebook. He had trusted her, not the colonels, not the system, her. And now, she was leaving without knowing how the story would be written. On the flight out the next day, the landscape stretched below her, endless brown hills and winding rivers. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass, memorizing it. This country had taken so much from her: sleep, innocence, friends, and yet it had given her something too, a truth she hadn't known she was searching for. That sometimes the greatest victories weren't marked by medals or reports. They were marked by small things: a boy's breath returning after hours of darkness, a stethoscope passed from one healer to another, a bracelet woven by hands that once trembled on the edge of death. She thought of Malik, vanishing into the dust with Ahmed, hunted from both sides yet still choosing to protect the sanctity of healing. She thought of Faird, bent over medical books in a Kabul room lit by a single lamp. And she thought of herself, caught between two worlds, not sure which one she belonged to anymore. As the aircraft lifted higher, the base shrinking below, Sarah whispered something no one else could hear. "I hope they use it right." The engines drowned her voice, carrying her away. But the weight of the bracelet on her wrist reminded her, some truths couldn't be drowned out. 3 weeks later, back home in Texas, the message reached her. Not through official channels, not through the army, but through whispers passed along until they found their way to her. Malik's intelligence had saved lives. 4 facilities still stood because of what he had given her. 17 healers, 100 patients alive. The relief hit harder than she expected. She sat at her parents' kitchen table, her civilian clothes stiff, unfamiliar on her body. The bracelet tapped softly against her coffee mug as she lifted it, her eyes blurring with tears. She didn't fight this time. She had carried his trust across a battlefield of doubt and bureaucracy. And somehow, against every instinct that told her it would be lost, it had reached where it needed to. But the victory didn't feel clean. It never did. Because she knew somewhere in the hills, Malik was still hunted. And somewhere in Kabul, Faird was studying to become what she had been, what she still was, even if no uniform told her so anymore. And she knew the war didn't stop just because she had left. But maybe, just maybe, healing had carved out a corner of it. Why did home feel like foreign soil? Sarah sat on the back porch of her parents' house in Texas, the cicadas buzzing in the summer dusk, the air thick with humidity. She should have felt relief. She should have felt safe. But instead, she felt disoriented, like the ground under her wasn't hers anymore. The world around her was ordinary: kids laughing down the block, sprinklers hissing across neatly trimmed lawns, the faint smell of barbecue drifting from a neighbor's yard. Yet none of it felt real. Her duffel bag sat inside her room, unopened since she landed. The uniform she had worn for 18 months lay folded inside, the desert dust still clinging to its seams. At the bottom, wrapped in white cloth, was the stethoscope Malik had given her. Around her wrist, the bracelet pressed softly against her skin, a constant reminder that Afghanistan wasn't gone. It was stitched into her. Every time she touched the bracelet, she thought of Malik walking away into the dust. Every time she saw the stethoscope, she thought of his brother, bent over books, dreaming of becoming a healer. The war hadn't ended. Not really. It had just changed shape. Her parents tried to celebrate her return. Her mother cooked her favorite meals. Her father sat beside her in the evenings, asking gentle questions he didn't press when she didn't answer. Her sister hugged her tight at the airport, whispering, "You're safe now," as if safety was a thing you could put on like a jacket. But Sarah didn't feel safe. She felt hollow. One night she sat alone at the kitchen table, the house quiet. Her discharge papers were on the counter, official and final. Beside them lay a stack of medical school brochures she hadn't opened yet. Her fingers hovered over them, but she couldn't bring herself to flip one open. How could she dream of the future when her mind still lived in the ward, still heard the cries of men torn apart, still saw the notebook filled with Malik's desperate handwriting? The news didn't help. Every channel seemed filled with reports of continued fighting overseas. Bombings, civilian casualties, words she had heard 100 times, but now each headline felt personal, as though it might contain someone she knew, as though Malik's name might appear between the lines or Ahmed. Her sister found her staring at the screen one evening. "Sarah," she said gently, "you can't carry it all. You did your part. You're home now." But Sarah shook her head. "I carried a man's trust home with me. That doesn't end just because I changed my clothes." Her sister didn't understand. How could she? She hadn't stood in the clearing, dust in her mouth, hearing the voice of a man who was supposed to be the enemy speak about protecting healers. She hadn't felt the weight of a gift pressed into her palm, a plea wrapped in leather and beads. Weeks passed. Sarah tried to adjust. She went running in the mornings, but the quiet streets felt too empty compared to the compound's shouts and engines. She met old friends for coffee, but their conversations about work, vacations, and relationships felt distant, like voices from another planet. She smiled when expected, laughed when she should, but inside she was adrift. Until one afternoon an envelope arrived. No return address. Just her name, written in careful, unfamiliar handwriting. Inside, a single sheet of paper. The message was brief, but it shook her. "Ferd has been accepted into medical school in Kabul. He wanted you to know. He says he studies because of you." Sarah read the words again and again until they blurred. She pressed the letter to her chest, tears slipping down her cheeks. It was proof. Proof that what she had carried across the desert, across oceans, across the silence of bureaucracy, had grown into something real, a boy's dream, a man's hope. That night, for the first time since coming home, she opened the brochures. She spread them across the table, touching the glossy pages like they were fragile. Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, programs with deadlines and requirements, with paths that felt overwhelming but possible. She stared at the stethoscope on her desk, the metal dull but strong. Her reflection shimmered faintly in it, fractured but present. She wasn't just a medic anymore. She could be more. But with the thought came fear. Could she heal without war pressing against her back? Could she save lives without the adrenaline, without the urgency of combat? Could she be Sarah again, not Doc Martinez? That question haunted her more than any dream. One evening, sitting outside under the Texas stars, her father joined her. He didn't ask questions. He just handed her a glass of water, sat beside her, and let the silence stretch. Finally, he spoke. "You know, your grandfather used to say dignity doesn't speak. It just acts. Maybe that's what you've been doing all along." Sarah looked at the bracelet on her wrist, at the stethoscope inside. She thought of Malik's words, Ahmed's voice, Ferd's dream. Maybe her father was right. Maybe healing wasn't about where you were or what uniform you wore. Maybe it was about choosing, again and again, to act. She closed her eyes, the cicadas buzzing, the night warm around her. And for the first time since leaving Afghanistan, she felt the faintest flicker of something she hadn't let herself believe in for months. Hoping. How far can a single choice reach? Years had passed since the dust of Afghanistan clung to Sarah's boots. The war was behind her, yet it was never truly gone. She carried it with her, not in scars or medals, but in symbols small enough to fit in her palm. A worn stethoscope, a leather bracelet, a memory of a man who should have been an enemy but wasn't. Dr. Sarah Martinez stood in the trauma ward of a Houston hospital, the hum of machines and the rush of footsteps familiar as breath. She wore scrubs now, not fatigues, but the weight of responsibility was the same. Lives pressed against her hands the way they had in the desert. The difference was the setting: clean floors instead of dust, fluorescent lights instead of desert sun. But blood was blood and hope was hope, no matter the walls that held it. Some nights when the ward grew quiet, she would pause at her desk. The stethoscope rested there, not her primary tool, too fragile for daily use, but a reminder. She kept it polished, the metal gleaming faintly. A relic of another healer across oceans, across divides, who had once placed it in her hands as a bridge between two worlds. And on her wrist always the bracelet. Patients noticed sometimes. "Lucky charm?" they'd ask with tired smiles. She would nod, though inside she knew it was more than that. It was proof that healing could create connections that outlasted war. News of Afghanistan still reached her. Reports of fighting, of politics shifting like sand. But once a letter found her, smuggled through channels as uncertain as whispers. It carried only a few lines. Faird is a doctor now. He works in Kabul in the same hospital where his father once did. He says he remembers every word you spoke, though you thought he could not hear you. He carries that with him every day. Sarah had read the letter alone in her apartment, the city lights glowing outside her window. Tears had blurred the words, but she hadn't wiped them away. For in those lines was the proof she had once feared might vanish. That her choice, on a night when others would have walked away from a dying boy, had rippled outward. A brother hunted had found hope. A boy broken had chosen healing. A legacy of destruction had bent, if only slightly, toward life. Years later, when she mentored new medical students, she told them stories, not of war, not of battles, but of choices, of seeing humanity before politics, of acting without knowing where the ripples might go. She never mentioned Malik by name. She never spoke of the clearing or the helicopter or the bullet holes in its frame. Some truths were too fragile to survive retelling. But sometimes, when the ward was quiet, she would touch the bracelet and remember. The dust, the silence, the man who had lowered his weapon and handed her trust instead. And she would whisper the lesson she had carried across continents, across years, across every sleepless night. That healing matters more than fighting. That dignity doesn't need to shout, it simply acts. That one decision, one refusal to look away, can travel farther than you ever imagine. Her life was proof. Malik's brother was proof. Every patient who woke to another sunrise because she had chosen to keep fighting for them was proof. The world was still divided, still fractured, still loud with conflict. But within it, bridges existed. Fragile, unexpected, built by hands that had chosen not to destroy, but to save. And sometimes, Sarah believed, those bridges mattered more than all the walls in the world.